All right, Susan, if you could advance the slide for us, that would be great. I'll kick us off. So welcome everyone. I'm Kelly McMahon. I'm from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, and I have the great honor of representing the GRAD partnership and this set of organizations that are considered the GRAD partnership's organizing members. So you'll see a lot of organizations here, and we have some colleagues here from them. Hello to friends again. It's nice to see you all. If you could advance, Susan, for us. So thank you for being here. The GRAD partnership is really, it's also about you all and everyone who's joining us in the larger big tent that this community of practice represents. Would love to hear who's in the space with us today. So if you could just take a moment and in the chat, let us know who you are, where you're joining from, and then any other introduction information you may want to share. Perhaps something interesting that's going on in your day. Anything that you might say. You can imagine if we were all sort of in a space, there would probably be something you might say about how you're doing, how's your weather, any of those sort of things. So feel free to drop that in the chat and say hello to each other. We want this to be a community space as much as it is a space for us to learn together. So that also depends on our willingness to share. It's also a good chance for you to find the chat, which we hope that you'll use throughout today's session to either ask questions or share additional resources. So keep your eye on the chat. We are glad that you are here. Susan, if you could advance for us. So the mission of the GRAD partnership is that we are partnering with communities to use high quality student success systems so that schools are empowered to graduate all students ready for the future. If you could advance. A lot of this work is really building on and extending work that has been going on for some time, oftentimes referred to as on-track work or early warning systems. And this is really sort of predicated on the power that we know from research. And some of that power is of the predictive indicators that ninth grade on track student achievement is the single best predictor of whether a student will graduate from high school within 4 years, more so than test scores, family income, race, or ethnicity. So paying attention to these transition points are particularly important. And the student success systems is really building on the power of that research over time. We're excited about today's presentation to learn more about powerful research. Susan, if you could advance for us. Student success systems, so what GRAD partnership is really offering is a way of extending some work that we have heard, as I mentioned, of on track or early warning systems. But this definition that we're hoping to share and sort of bring community around is organizing a school community to better support the academic progress, high school graduation, post-secondary success rates, and the well-being of all students. It's really the bringing together of sort of 4 key components. That includes combining a focus on building strong relationships, with real-time, actionable, holistic data, and then all of that data being useful and important in helping us create strategic improvement actions. So how do we create the conditions in the high school of making that data useful so that we can respond and adapt as necessary? And this work is shaped by student-centered mindsets. If you could advance for us, Susan. And all of these things together is the integration of these things that really are what we mean when we say a student success system. So yes, it's important to have holistic data, but it's really about bringing that into interaction with these strategic improvement actions and also supportive relationships and student-centered mindsets, all of these things working together to create the system of everyone kind of working together to focus on student success and partnering towards that. Susan, if you could advance for us. And why we need these things now. So why is now such an important time? We've learned from the pandemic that we really need integrated systems that allow us to extend some of the work that's been going on and building on it. So it's a really important time to focus on school connectedness and its importance for academic achievement, which we'll hear more about today. It allows us to use leading indicators like student agency, belonging, connectedness. It allows us to track academic gains in real time. It allows us to know if things that we're trying in our schools are actually improvements and for whom and under what conditions. It's also really important because student success systems, that integrated approach, allows us to really understand and show both students and teachers that people are working together, and it's not just some individuals, but instead sends that message that we're in this work together. And then allows us to focus on post-secondary readiness and post-secondary preparedness, and not just graduation, because we know that it's important about what comes next. So all of these things, student success systems, are particularly relevant for right now. Susan, if you could advance for us. And we come together in this work to learn more about this important work of student success systems and connect with each other. So our community of practice is really meant to be a big tent space where we can bring together across the country who are interested in both implementing student success systems, improving their current work, and then also innovating. So how we can innovate together. This space allows us to have a shared learning space where we can learn together. Ideally, it's generating motivation and inspiration, and we are defined by our mutual engagement. Susan, if you could advance. All of this works with our community agreements to each other. So this is a we, not me space. We share our stories and our airtime. We accept non-closure. We're going to talk about some big things in the space, and we may not get the final answers, but the whole point is to kind of learn together, and we just be a start of a conversation instead of the end of it. We use the ideas, we keep the details in the community. Sometimes the best things that we can learn are from our mistakes or failures, but it's important to remember those lessons learned, as opposed to Carnegie has a really hard time with PDSAs. That's not particularly useful. Instead, it's the idea of what makes PDSAs or planned do study act cycles. Why are those so challenging? We share to learn, and sometimes that sharing is really it could be a new idea that maybe you hadn't had before, but in this space we get to try it out, or it's a question, it's a space to share that question so we can learn some more and we reflect on it. We also share our good work. So this is an opportunity, as I mentioned before, an opportunity to share. We'll have a space to reflect on what we're hearing today, but also a chance to share some of our own context and work. And in doing so, we all get to learn from that, which is a really important and real value asset of this community. And I appreciate you being willing to contribute that to it. And then we make room for joy. It's always a lot more fun when we can learn together. So let's make some room for joy and find some space to laugh together, because that's always a little bit better. Susan, if you could advance. Today, though, I'm really excited to share. We have, for our today's learning session, we have Dr. Shanette Porter, who is the co-director of the Equitable Learning and Development Group and a senior research associate at the University of Chicago Consortium. And she's the lead author on a really compelling report that came out this April called Investing in Adolescents, the Role of School Culture in Shaping Student Trajectories, which was a report that she did with collaboration with Bo Jackson and then Dr. Kegel. I think I said his name wrong, and then also John Easton, all folks connected with the University of Chicago Consortium. And so I'm really excited to turn it over to Dr. Porter, who's going to share this study with us. We'll have an opportunity afterwards to ask questions, but if you want to feel free as they come up, your questions in the chat, and we will have some space to respond to those. So feel free to drop those in the chat as we go through. But without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Dr. Porter.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks for having me. I really appreciate you all inviting me into this space. Today, I'm going to talk about exactly what Kelly said, but I want to give a little bit of background about where this study came from. So I'm going to talk about a study that was really born out of conversations we were having back in 2015 with researchers, educators, policymakers, intermediary organizations, foundations. I want to take you back to that time with me when socioemotional development wasn't nearly as politicized. And there was, in fact, nearly a consensus across perspectives that socioemotional development was in itself sort of good or bad. It was just something that happened. It's a developmental, young people are going through developmental stages of socioemotional development. And really that schools and classrooms being places where young people spend the lion's share of their time were sites for positively and productively shaping students' socioemotional development. So the main question at that time was just, how do you measure it? And so I don't know if people remember kind of Angela Duckworth and David Yeager's paper, I think in Ed Researcher, lots of practical practice and policy reports about it. Really just how do you measure it, and can students self-report their socioemotional experiences in ways that are practically meaningful, while also being kind of reliable and valid by scientific standards. So that was that. Fast forward about a year, we developed a paper that showed in very nuanced ways that, in fact, students self-reports of their social well-being and persistence, their effort and their hard work, these socioemotional factors had excellent measurement properties, and conceivably could be used to understand their experiences in practical settings. But that paper will never see the light of day. It actually feels really good to be able to speak it right here in this recorded kind of conversation, so that somebody knows somewhere that this paper happened. Because by 2016, just a year later, still, early 2016, we started having very different conversations. And this time, what seemed to be on people's minds was, does high school even matter? Are young people crystallized by the time they're in 9th grade? And people would cite these very modest impacts of high schools on test scores. And so we happened to have this paper hanging around on socioemotional factors, and we thought, well, maybe people think high schools don't matter because we're not measuring all of the right things, all of the various ways in which high schools are supporting young people to develop that actually show up in their adulthood. So we went to the research to see what the scientific literature had to say about whether high schools matter, and we found that, and you can skip the next slide and then right to the next one if you could, Susan. There you go, thank you. So what we found is that research does suggest that high schools matter for students' educational, social, and economic trajectories, but these studies usually found, like I said, kind of only modest impact, really small impacts. And most of the rigorous quantitative and qualitative studies relied on small or specialized samples like Catholic students or charter school lotteries, which weren't necessarily representative of many students' experiences, or these studies tended to focus on the role of improving test scores for catalyzing kind of positive shifts in students' trajectories. You can leave it on that slide. So our research, by contrast, oops, nope, can you go back one slide? Thank you. Our research, by contrast, used a large sample of 8th and 9th graders, which represented all of Chicago public schools and potentially other kind of large districts in the US. We examined the role of schools impacts on multiple dimensions of student growth in shaping students' trajectories. So we went beyond test scores to include socioemotional development, really importantly, as measured by student surveys, as well as school behaviors, which were measured by administrative data on attendance, disciplinary infractions and suspensions, out of school suspensions. We combined all these to create a school effectiveness measure, which I'll say a bit more about in a few slides and throughout the rest of this conversation. And as a bonus, I'll mention here, our study design and analysis used value-added modeling, which I'll also talk about a bit more in a minute, which has been shown to be really comparable to experimental designs, right? Meaning that we can generate causal conclusions from our work, which is a gap in the kind of broader, rigorous qualitative and quantitative research base to this point. Next slide, please. All right, so now that you have that background, I want to just share our 3 major findings. So after I do this, I'll back up and we'll go through the study design and each finding. But first, I want to just kind of let you know where we're heading. So first, we found that the most effective high schools, those that fostered holistic student growth on socioemotional development, test scores, and attendance and disciplinary behaviors, improved students' trajectories through high school and into college. Second, and if you take away just one thing today, I would love for it to be this, that fostering socioemotional development and to some extent behaviors had far and away the greatest impact on students' long-run trajectories. In some cases, twice the impact of fostering test score growth only. And finally, effective high schools had, this will surprise no one, supportive, collaborative, and academically rigorous climates and cultures. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over the study design briefly, and you can actually just go right to the next slide. Thank you. So we use administrative data from 143 CPS schools. This included charter and traditional schools. between the 2011 to 2012 academic year and the 2016 to 2017 academic year. And we estimated value added on first-time ninth graders. We just always like to give a shout out. Thank you so much for our partnership and agreement with CPS. So thank you, CPS. We do not take for granted having access to this really rich data. And then I'll just mention, because I know some people are going to be interested in some of these details, you know, our sample sizes range from 160,000 for when we're looking at just ninth graders or young people moving from 8th to 9th grade in that time period. For high school outcomes, it's going to shrink a bit because, you know, the cohorts who were later in the sample, who started in, say, 2013, 2014, weren't necessarily getting to high school outcomes. And same thing for college outcomes. They just weren't old enough by the time we ended the study. So we lost, you know, 2/3 of the sample by the time we got to college going outcomes, but you can see it's still a very large, well-powered sample. All right, next slide, please. All right, so for this research, we created, as I mentioned, a new definition of school effectiveness that is uncorrelated with student demographics or weakly correlated with them. And the focus of much of the rest of what I'll say today is really about the school effectiveness index or measure. The school, and I'm not keeping track of the chat. Okay, so please do flag me if there are questions coming in. So the school effectiveness measure is, in short, the combined impact of schools on students' test scores, behaviors, which you see there, attendance, disciplinary infractions, and out-of-school suspensions, social well-being, which is self-reported on 2 survey measures there, emotional health and school connectedness, and their academic effort and work, also self-reported on measures called study habits, grit, and academic engagement. Together, I'll just mention here, and then I don't think I mentioned again, that we combine social well-being and academic effort and work, all those self-report measures, into something called socioemotional development measure. And so that's how it will be referred to going forward. Okay, so we combine across essentially 3 things, right? Test scores, behavior, socioemotional development, and really we combine across schools' impacts on all of those dimensions to create the school effectiveness index. So essentially, this index is a measure of schools' ability to foster students' growth on these dimensions, and that's basically all you need to know. But for those of you who are interested, I'll say quickly how we calculated the school effectiveness measure. I'll give just like a slightly more detail. So I imagine that many of you are familiar with value-added modeling, and this uses the same basic methodological kind of principles and underlying logic. It's exactly the same, in fact. You know, historically, value-added modeling has really been used to understand teachers and schools' impacts on standardized test score growth or large-scale assessment growth. And it asks this question, right? How much does attending, it's supposed to ask a question, how much does attending one school versus another matter? In this case, we applied that to socioemotional development. So the socioemotional, among the other 3 things, we applied to test scores, behaviors, and socioemotional development. I'm going to walk you through the socioemotional development example. So the socioemotional development value added estimate captures how much a school changes, so increases or decreases students' self-reports of their socioemotional development from 8th to 9th grade, as compared to how much socioemotional development would have changed from 8th to 9th grade if the student attended another school. So in other words, these value addeds isolate and estimate the causal influence of a school. And then, of course, our school effectiveness measure estimated the combined impact of schools across all of these 3 dimensions. I'll also at one point talk a little bit about, importantly, kind of the distinct impacts of value addeds for each of the individual value added. So I'll have kind of one slide on test score value added versus behavior value added versus socioemotional development value added. I just want to pause really quickly. That's kind of the crux of the research, and mostly the rest of it is just what does school effectiveness predict, and how does it matter in the long term, and how do schools differ on school effectiveness? So I want to just check and see if everybody is kind of clear on that, and then we can move to the next slide. Okay. All right, well, feel free to pop anything in if anything else comes up. Okay, so then I'll just move to what our key questions were. The first is just what are the effects of attending a high school that is one standard deviation higher than average, above average on that school effectiveness index. And our long run measures included high school graduation, college going, and actually college continuing to the second year. I don't show that today, but similar effects there if anyone wants to talk about them. And then 11th grade school-based arrests at any point during high school. So this includes arrests for things that happen on campus, as well as if something happened outside of school, sometimes students, because they are can be located in school, are arrested for things that happen outside of school. Those are also included here. And then our second question was, how do the climates and cultures of more versus less effective schools differ? And so for that, we'll look at the 5 essential survey and see if we can distinguish between more and less effective schools by their school cultures. Next slide, please. All right, here's what we found, and you can go to the next slide. Okay, so here's what we found. First, these graphs are just an illustration. Let's go to the first graph first. It's an illustration of the long run impacts of attending an effective high school in 9th grade. So 1 standard deviation above the median. In all cases, I'm going to show you kind of 3 graphs. This is the first of them. The y-axis is given in percentages. And each dot represents a few schools. It's called binning. We can talk about that if you want, but just know that's not an individual school. That's a bin of I think like 10 schools, maybe a little more than that. The left graph shows that the difference in likelihood of high school graduation between a school at the medium of effectiveness, so that's at that 0 on the x-axis, and a school at 2 standard deviations above average is about 4 percentage points. So you move from about a 74% likelihood to a 78% likelihood when you move from the median to 2 standard deviations above the median. Can you use the animation there and click the slide? Thank you. Can you go back one? Thank you. Okay, so the right graph shows a similarly positive relationship between school effectiveness and educational attainment as measured by college going. And this includes college going to any 2-year or 4-year college. And you'll see here that students are about 5 percentage points more likely to go to college if they attended schools that are 2 standard deviations above the median on school effectiveness. So we see these strong and positive relationships between school effectiveness, fostering growth on those 3 dimensions, and educational attainment. So let's look at a social outcome on the next slide. Can you press the next slide, please? Thank you. So this graph shows that attending an effective school matters for school-based arrests as well. So attending an effective school in 9th grade decreased students' likelihood of being arrested at school and/or having an arrest that is reported to the school. The y-axis is the percent of school-based arrests, and the x-axis is, again, this combined value-added school effectiveness index. And then attending a school, let's just walk through this one more time. Attending a school at 1 standard deviation above the median reduces the likelihood that a student would be arrested by about 0.8 percentage points. So I want to say 2 quick things about that 0.8%. First, that's really a 20% decline in arrests because the overall rate of arrest is about 4%. And so then a 0.8 percentage drop is about a 20% decline in arrests. And second, looking at this kind of the table that I put in here to the right, this table really demonstrates that there's sort of an outsized impact that effective schools would have on Black boys, right? Since they're the most likely to be arrested. All right, so I'm going to show kind of a summary. If you can go to the next slide. So far we've looked at the combined effective schools on those 3 dimensions. Let's kind of pull them apart here and see what is actually the impact of each one individually. So I think basically all I want to say about here, right, there's just kind of one big takeaway, is that schools that foster growth on, or maybe 2, okay, if schools that foster growth on any dimension of student growth matter, for students' longer run trajectories. However, school impacts on socioemotional development have the greatest influence on likelihood of graduating from high school and going to college. And school impacts on behaviors are the best predictor of whether or not a student will be arrested at school. The key takeaway, the one I was saying there's kind of one, is that school impacts on test score growth matter for longer run trajectories, but they're never the strongest impact. Okay. Let's move to the second research question. The remainder of this is just a couple of slides where I'm going to just talk about how to affect this. What do we know so far? So we have some new questions we want to ask about how these schools differ. But in this study, we really looked at how school culture differed across more and less effective schools. So in other words, kind of what characterizes the climate and organizational context of effective schools. So we turned to data that are publicly available because we thought that in the absence of kind of the value-added data we use in our study, or kind of the statistical infrastructure you would need to actually calculate and analyze, calculate the information or analyze this data, perhaps school culture and climate could be used as a proxy measure of school effectiveness. So what we have here is a summary of the My Voice, My School or 5 Essential survey that's taken in CPS once per year. I won't spend a lot of time on this since I know many of you are very familiar with this survey, but briefly, it includes teacher and student measures. Multiple measures comprise each of the 5 essentials, and those 5 essentials are written in there in the diagram in the middle. They're effective leaders, kind of a measure of teacher-principal relationships, it's school mission coherence, collaborative teachers, a measure of teachers' school commitment and collaborative practice, supportive environment, a measure of school safety, high expectations, support for students to engage in kind of challenging academic work, involve families, of course, a measure of school relationships with students' families and families' influence in school, and finally, ambitious instruction, which is a measure of the extent to which classrooms are discussion-based and engaging. So for our study, we averaged across all 5 of these essentials to create one composite school climate and culture score for each school. Next slide, please. Thank you. So let's just look quickly now at the relationship between school climate and school effectiveness. So on this graph, we kind of tipped it a little bit. The school effectiveness index is on the y-axis now, and school climate measured by the kind of composite 5 essential measure is on school climate and culture, I should say, is on the x-axis. And this time each dot is a school. So we found that this kind of composite 5 essential survey climate and culture measure strongly and positively predicted school effectiveness. Schools that were 1 standard deviation higher in school climate were on average 0.6 standard deviations higher in school effectiveness. Maybe the way to think about this, though, is that school climate explains 76% of the variation in school effectiveness. So, about 76% of the time, if you have a school that has a positive school culture, it's also a school that's highly effective. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so each of the essentials is also independently predictive of school effectiveness. And I just want to name here, can you click the slide? Thank you. Okay. So we see that supportive, so each is individually predictive. That's all the 5 essentials of school effectiveness. But supportive environment and ambitious instruction each explain 2/3 of the variation in school effectiveness, and collaborative teachers explains about 40% of the variation in school effectiveness. So we see it a lot about relationships here. And really together with this last slide, my kind of takeaways are that it's really consistent with other literature and interdisciplinary literature. And that, a school's influence on student development likely operates through this ecology of students and personnel and policies and practices, like what makes up school culture and climate. And adolescents may be particularly responsive, if you're looking at this slide, to rigorous academic environments, but that have the relational ties that scaffold and support their success. All right, so now I just have a few key takeaways on the last slide, and then I think we'll open it to questions. All right, so the key takeaways, well, I would love to hear what your takeaways are, but here are ours. So one, high schools matter. That's the question we started with. We want to end with that one too. And maybe they can matter even more, right? And related to this, right, like students in high schools are malleable. They're in this really exploratory stage in adolescence when they're seeking to understand who they are and where they fit and who they want to be now and in the future. And schools really have an opportunity to shape that. When I don't think I'm saying anything that's like controversial here, but there was a moment where I feel like that question was really coming up. When the second kind of takeaway to me is when schools foster socioemotional development, students are more likely to thrive in high school and beyond. So schools that foster socioemotional development are where deep, rich learning is happening and life skills are being developed. And we can see that, we know that because it's showing up later in their educational attainment and their trajectories. I don't think that this means teaching socioemotional development in school per se, but thinking about how can schools be designed, what structures are needed to foster socioemotional development, what pedagogies, what teacher means. It seems to me that sort of like the work of fostering socioemotional development includes cultivating an environment in which students develop stronger social skills that enable them to interact kind of positively and productively with peers and teachers, in which students develop connections to their peers and feel a stronger sense of belonging in their schools, and in which students' sort of natural orientation toward hard work and effort and engagement is nurtured. The third takeaway is one that I feel like principals always like when I say, which is that like school quality ratings that focus on test score growth miss some of the important ways that high schools foster student learning and thriving. So test scores just don't tell the whole story. And if we're only focusing on test scores, we'll miss some of the most effective schools. This might already be apparent to educators, to parents, to school leaders. The fourth takeaway is that climate is an indicator of schools' abilities to facilitate positive long-run trajectories for their students. Our evidence that we presented today, that we presented in the study, and that I presented today, is consistent with lots of work that finds that school climate shapes student experiences. And I want to note and just underscore that in particular, effective schools are both rigorous and relationship-oriented. And last, and this is kind of my favorite takeaway, is that adolescents are reliable and valid informers on their experiences and environments. So, right, we can listen to students. We could use surveys to do that. I know I do in all of my work, but also structured interviews, time for reflection, formal conversations. And given how keen observers adolescents are of both their environments and themselves, we can consider ways to foster student agency, share power, co-construct environments with them. And that is all I had. So thank you. And I would just love to know what's your questions.
Oh, yeah, thank you, Dr. Porter. I'm going to let other folks who perhaps have questions. We had two who had put those into the chat, so I just want to surface those. And they got thumbs up. So I'm wondering if other people were wondering about these. But Daniel had asked, and this was in reference to slides 21 and 22. So I don't know if we want to head back there. Yes. But for the sub question in number 1, were students who transition into technical training or directly into careers counted? So I think it has to do with the.
It was only, so if those schools were designated as 2-year or 4-year institutions, then yes, otherwise no. Yeah. And we use the I think College Board data, but let me go back and make sure that that's true. But yeah, it depended on how they were characterized. In terms, yep. And then for the impacts, I'm happy to take this question from Liza as well. From the impact slide, how are you defining impact versus strongest impact? It's a really good question. Let's see, how far back is it?
I think it was slide 23.
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. So everything on here is significant. So let me just start there, right? These are all significant findings. So if we say impact, that's the first part of the question. We're saying that it was significant, so that behaviors matter statistically significantly. for high school graduation and for enrollment. The strongest impact is just a relative comparison. So we just said, which explain the most variation. And so that got the strongest impact. I can say for high school graduation and enrollment, it was nearly double, or at least double the impact between test scores and socioemotional development, between fostering test scores and fostering socioemotional development. I am a little fuzzier on the difference between school impacts on behaviors versus socioemotional development, or school impacts on behaviors versus test scores. Can't remember now if they fell in the middle or not, but those are, but to answer your question, there's that. And in the report, I'll say that we give all the actual numbers. And so that report that was dropped earlier has the actual kind of beta coefficients and R squares and the variation explained.
All right, we have one more question from Eli. Hold on, there's more questions. Move the chat. So when school leaders say to you that they want to get better at fostering social emotional development or develop a better school climate, what do you say to them, or where do you direct them?
I think that's a really good question. That was like, I know Kelly and I had lots of conversations before this where I'm like, this is a question everyone always wants to know. And I'm like, you know, I think, yes, it's an excellent question. I found, this is a little bit of a cop-out, but I found that the way to the answer in this question is really in conversation. So I'm really excited to see what you all do in your breakouts and how this resonates with you and how you think about your own context, because I find that it differs quite a bit. But one of the things that surfaces from those conversations are the structures that you can leverage in your school already right now to support, for example, belonging or better student engagement. And so there's not sort of like one answer to me. It really depends on your environment, how you're positioned, and also what's already going on in your school. So, you know, some schools have restorative justice rooms, or like restorative places or calming spaces in their classroom. So that might be something, right? How do you lean into that? Or maybe that's something that you want to bring in. Some schools are thinking about in their instructional practice, how do we create better kind of cultural, and in their materials, cultural representation, so that we can avoid, or that we can support students to see themselves in the instructional materials, right? Which fosters and engenders a sense of belonging. So there are many, many, many answers. And I'll say this, and this is not too much about, but right now I'm at the Consortium and the Equitable Learning and Development Group. And there's certainly a tool that we use, the Cultivate survey that we developed, that really, and there's an Elevate tool as well that corresponds to it, that really is about starting with the students and hearing what they have to say. We're not going to be able to do that today in our conversations, but it's a survey tool that, and we could drop the link to it. I'll try to find it when you all go to breakouts. It's a survey tool. Oh, you got it. Okay, thank you. That asks students about their classroom environment and their own experiences, and can be used then to understand how students are experiencing school. And then you can engage students in a conversation with teachers around what that means for them, what kind of shifts you could make, but you'd also identify potentially where are the opportunities. So is it a sense of belonging? Is it in terms of not feeling like their identities are affirmed? Is it that they're not seeing meaning in work, for example? And so it helps to, I think, identify where there are opportunities for growth in a classroom. And then conceivably, you'd work with students to see where you might go from there. Like we use PDSA, so you all will love that. Yeah, sort of continuous improvement models, but I'm sure there are other models and strategies, but those are the various ways I would answer that question. And one of the reasons I like giving this having this conversation with folks is because people always come up with really great ideas that they can share with others around how they see themselves in this work, what they're already doing, and where they see opportunities to maybe shift already. So I'm more looking to you all to share back after the breakouts. How does this resonate with you? And what's your answer to Eli's questions here? Oh, and you asked school leaders. I'm sorry, I missed that piece. But I hope that answered your question anyway, Eli. And if not, I'm happy to follow up afterwards. I was thinking just for schools broadly.
I'm going to take a little liberty. I think, Val, I really appreciate your question also, which was that you mentioned that it's not necessarily teaching about teaching social emotional development explicitly, but mentioned there's some pedagogy, et cetera, that would help social emotional development. Did your research point to some specifics that were most effective? And I think your answer kind of just spoke to that a little bit, but is there, I'll turn it over to you to see if there's a way to answer that, or if it's something that could perhaps come out in the conversations.
Val said that she feels I answered it, so I'm glad. And Val,
Okay.
You can always, I know Val, you can follow up with me if you want to know more too, or happy to follow up with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, then if that's the case, just so we save some time for folks can talk to each other. Thank you, Val.
That sounds great.
Cecilia had a question, and then we'll go to breakouts. Under school behaviors, how did you define attendance, and what weight did you assign attendance and discipline?
I'm not sure I'm following the second part of that question. I'm wondering if we could get to breakouts. Maybe I could follow up with Cecilia. So I'm not sure I'm following the what weight did you assign attendance and discipline.
That sounds great. Or
yeah,
we can think more about it. All right. With that, thank you all so much. I appreciate these questions. Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Porter, for answering them. And I noticed that we're losing people as we talk about breakouts, which is such a bummer. But I guess there's some the people here who are willing to stay. I would love to hear your thoughts about this. So in the breakouts, we have some questions about just an opportunity to share, for you personally, what resonated with you in hearing this research. As Dr. Porter mentioned, when we were talking about this presentation, one of the things that's interesting is this research is really affirming for a lot of the work that people do, but not necessarily explanatory or pointing people to it. So this is an opportunity to hear from you guys in your work, what are the things that perhaps resonated? And then a specific question around how might you operationalize this in your context? Are there things that you do that are focused on, places where you've seen that focusing on social emotional development has really mattered, or places where thinking about school climate, and yes, it's specific to that breakout of the way that they've defined school climate, but ways in which climate really matters, or things that you've seen schools or districts do that emphasize that. And then a question around how might you use this research? I think conversations, particularly now, have gotten somewhat heated in certain places about the focus on social emotional development and its connection or research or relatedness to academics, or what high schools could be doing. Are there ways in which you could potentially think about using this research? And then just what remaining questions you have, so space to answer that. So I think my colleague Susan has dropped in the chat for you a link to a note catcher that is there. So if you just want to grab that link, there's a space. So when you get in the breakout, just say hello to your new friends, and then feel free to take on any of those questions that seem most relevant. We'll have about 12 minutes. We'll go for 12 minutes into the breakouts as a chance to just talk with one another. And then we'll come back and see what we can surface and sort of close out from there. So Susan, are you ready to send folks to breakouts?
I am, yes.
Okay, great. All right. We'll look forward to hearing your thoughts when you come back. Thanks, everyone.
Can we pause can we pause?
Welcome back. I know that was probably a very short amount of time. Welcome back. Thank you to all the folks who took notes. I was looking at some of the note catchers, some really great stuff in there. I appreciate the questions that people were raising and the conversations that people were having. Sounds like some really rich dialogue there. So it's great. I just want to share that Dr. Porter found the answer to Cecilia's question, I think. And it's in the chat. I'll just, for the purpose of our recording, share that attendance was measured by days absent. Just want to make sure that I'm answering the right thing. And she's willing to reconnect with you or connect with you, Cecilia, outside of this if you want to learn more about the kind of technical things there. So, and she can send the factor loadings and the construction of the behavior value added and school effectiveness value added. So feel free to, hopefully this can continue this, but thank you for a great question.
Yeah.
All right. I also just want to thank you all for your engagement today. I really appreciate it. Dr. Porter had this really awesome comment that was like, this research is really important and whatnot, but in lots of ways, she feels like she's not satisfying people's wondering of like, well, how do we use it? How do we use this really important research? And her acknowledgement was like, practice in lots of ways is sort of in front of the research, and that you all are actually kind of the real sources of information about the practices that you're doing in context and the spaces. And so I just want to thank you for being here, because I think the opportunity to engage and share the work that you're all doing in the context where you are is a really rich opportunity to learn together. So thank you for engaging in this community and making it such a great learning resource. I hope you'll continue to do so and invite your friends. And I'm sure you didn't fall down. Susan, thank you for sharing. So hopefully everybody's leaving with something that they can do next, that you can try by next week, something you take with you. I saw some folks hoping to use this research in ways to like have some conversations or use it, some of the other things to kind of explore in your work. Susan, if you could advance, I just want to point people to our next community of practice. As I said, please invite some friends. That will be on September 19th. And our speakers will be Sarah Howard from Network for College Success, and then two colleagues, Jenny Scala and Kylie Klein from American Institutes for Research. We're going to present GRAD Partnership is developing a district reflection tool. So an opportunity for intermediaries and districts to learn about how might we support schools and educators with implementing, improving, and innovating on their student success system. So please join us for that. I think it'll be another rich conversation. And if you could advance forward for us, Susan, there's an opportunity to learn together. So one of the things GRAD Partnership is developing is an introduction to student success systems. This is an online module. It's meant to be really brief, 15 minutes engagement. If you'd be willing to either test that with us, or if perhaps there's someone who you're interested in sharing student success with them and you're curious about their ability to like pick this up and what it might be, and they would want to test this, we are welcoming people who they don't have to know anything about student success systems to test this module and take it and see if they could give us some feedback so that we can improve it. There's an opportunity to sign up to test that. So if you're willing, or if you have a colleague or someone you know that you might want to share this with, we would welcome a chance to learn from people's real feedback. So my colleague Susan has dropped in there. With a final note, we welcome your feedback on this session today. And so Susan's also going to drop in there a survey that's less than 2 minutes, very brief, just your feedback, help us improve our community practice. And with that, I just want to close with a huge thank you to Susan, who has helped out with all the Zoom, dropping in links and questions and managing breakouts and all that. So thank you, Susan. And thank you, Dr. Porter, for sharing this research with us and with the community and being willing to engage in the conversation. It's really important, and I really appreciate your willingness to share with us. So thank you for being here. All right, with that, I know we're over time. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Look forward to seeing you next time.